Welcome back to another episode of Learning Vue.js the hard way. And what I mean with the hard way is that we're learning Vue.js by simply reading the documentation, page by page. And so the unique selling point of this series is that I'm trying to read as much as possible, or rather speak as much as possible, so that your eyes don't have to be glued to the screen, so that hopefully you can learn Vue.js by sort of glancing at the screen sometimes, but mostly sort of multitask and do something else. We'll see how that works out. But last time we finished up talking about the first page of the documentation. Not really the first page. I mean, the first page is the installation page, but we finished up talking about the introduction. So we finished this sort of introduction chapter. And now we are at the chapter called the Vue Instance. So if you just check the subchapters here, the subchapters are creating a Vue instance, data and methods, instance lifecycle hooks, and the lifecycle diagram, right? So on a sort of high level or an overview level, we're going to talk about how to create a Vue instance and probably what that means, right? And then some data and methods that are available on the Vue instance. So in other words, properties and methods that you can access on a Vue instance. And then instance lifecycle hooks, right? So think about the term hooks. Hooks is like when an object is allowing you to supply it a function that it will call when something happens, right? That was a strange way of expressing a callback, right? So I mean, in a language where functions are first-class citizens, such as JavaScript, and a function being a first-class citizen simply just means that you can pass around the function. You can take a function, put it into a variable, and pass it around. That's like a callback, right? Like you construct a function, you put the function in a variable, and you pass the function elsewhere, and then that thing can decide to call that function whenever it wants to. And so that's what a hook is doing. You take a function that you want, put it into a variable. You don't necessarily have to put it into a variable, but it makes sense to think of it as that. You choose a function, you put that function in a variable, and then you pass that function into the hook function, or the hook method of whoever is exposing this hook method, and then it will then call this hook method upon the thing that you're hooking into, right? So it's like you could say, before I want to listen to this event where before any data is changed, I want you to call this method, right? So Vue listens to changes, right? The reactivity system we've talked a lot about. So if you're hooking into the before changed method, I don't know if there is a before changed method, but I mean, I assume there is, or rather, I know they have one. I don't know if it's called exactly that, but I assume it is. So if you're hooking into that, then that your function of choice would be called when every time before any data is changed, essentially. And so, I mean, different ways of thinking about this is just like observer pattern, events, and yeah, I mean, if you're in an object-oriented language, it would kind of be like passing in an observer that sort of has one method that is the method that the hooker. Whoa, sorry, that turned out very strange. I mean, as in the thing that you can hook into. I apologize for that. The thing that you can hook into, so the observable, right? The observable, when you pass in, sorry, now I get completely thrown off track. When you pass, so you pass an observer to that observable, for example, and then that observable could be the Vue instance, and then you're sort of listening to some particular lifecycle event, which could be then, for example, before any data has changed. Actually, there is another object-oriented design pattern which is specifically designed for this. I mean, we're still essentially talking about observer pattern, but its name escapes me now, and I guess like semantically it would be more appropriate to talk about that. Anyways, now we're totally on a sidetrack, right? That was just what like hooks are, right? So Vue exposes a few hooks that you can hook into and do useful things. And then they show this, like the next subsection is the lifecycle diagrams, and then they'll show sort of the lifecycle of a Vue instance and like all the places that you can hook into. We'll see how far we get today, whether we get through all of this stuff or maybe not. So let me just bump up the font size here so it's easier to read. Okay. So the Vue instance, creating a Vue instance. I actually suspect that there's going to be a lot of repetition in this section because we've kind of thoroughly covered the Vue instance in the previous episodes. But I think it makes sense to quickly go through this anyway, just to make sure that A, we were not incorrect before, and B, just a review, right? So let's do this. Okay, so every Vue application starts by creating a Vue instance, right? This we know. And here they call the variable VM, right? So they say var VM equals new Vue, and then they pass in a hash, or sorry, if I accidentally say hash sometimes, it's because I used to program a lot in Ruby, and in Ruby, objects like this, like dictionaries, are essentially hashes. So hash, same thing as object, or POJO, right? Plain JavaScript object. Just a JavaScript object. This thing is what I'm referring to. Okay, so they call the variable VM, and then they're explaining why they're calling it VM here. So they're saying, okay, although Vue is not strictly associated with the MVVM pattern, so the model view model pattern. Let's just see what they're linking to here in the link. Is that Wikipedia? Yeah. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, no, maybe actually we didn't ever go to the link, right? But in the first episode we talked quite extensively about model view model. So if you haven't watched that episode, be sure to watch that if you want to know more about model view model pattern. And you can just see, let's just see here, right? So in this picture, let me make that a bit bigger, right? You can see that they are the view. There's a data binding between the view and the view model, and the view model talks to the model, right? So yeah, and both views and view models are concerned with presentation and presentation logic, and the model is, well, or I shouldn't say the model, the models are concerned with business logic and data. Business logic, like what your application actually does, right? So as we talked about there in the first episode, the view model is essentially just used to avoid putting a lot of logic in the view, essentially, right? So then you're trying to make views very light and very declarative, and then you're delegating complex calculations to the view model. So for example, I mean, if you're let's say computing some form of, I don't know, like if you're computing stuff, right? Essentially, like if you're taking multiple input pieces, like multiple pieces of data, and then constructing some form of aggregation, right? But you can even do like very simple stuff. Like you could argue that if you want to have a string representation, which is a full name string representation, and you want to put that into a single variable, then that might belong in the view model rather than in the view. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's a shaky example, right? I was going to say, like, because it depends on whether you want to do first name, comma, last name, or something like that. But that would actually probably more belong in the view if that was a bad example. But yeah, I mean, more like if you have to do calculation. I'm trying to figure out, like, let's say you're storing something which isn't, maybe something like, no, but that would also maybe be in a model. But something like, let's say, when you're bowling, right? Depending on how many, like the sport bowling, like depending on how many pins are still left when you've thrown your, what is that called? I mean, ball, I guess. It's called different things, right? Something like that. So there could be a string representation depending on how many pins there are left, and that might be a computed, or I mean, that should be a computed property, because that's the consequence of how many pins and it is left, and it makes more sense, or are left, and it makes more sense to store the pins that are left. So the model would know about the pins, and then maybe you have some other place where you compute the number or the string representation of those pins, and maybe that's not a concern for the model, but that's a concern for the view model that maybe delegates to some other model that performs exactly that calculation, and then it's so that the view can have access to it. Anyways, now we're totally off track, right? Okay, so model view model. Okay, that's view is loosely based on model view model, and that's why they often use the variable VM. right? Because that's short for view model. So I guess we'll try and call our instances VM as well, just to be sort of consistent, right? Let me just remind you, if I just look at the files that we have in this directory, we have an index file and we have a main.js file, and these are the files that we've been working on for the last couple of episodes, like from the start. So let me just jump into Vim and let's go to main.js and let's exchange, like we used to call it app, but let's now call our application VM, right? Just now we're consistent. Okay. By the way, if you haven't watched the other episodes, and if you feel like this is jumping in too much in the deep end, be sure to check out the other episodes. If you're following along this series, remember to subscribe so that you won't miss the upcoming videos in this series. And also, I do a bunch of other videos. But anyways, let's continue. So that's the view model. Okay, and then when you create a Vue instance, you pass in an options object. This we know, we've talked about, like, right? Like if you know what, look at our example here. This whole thing is the options object. So it's like we're saying var VM equals new view, and then we're passing in this hash or this dictionary or this object or this pojo, right? A bunch of key values, and that's our options object, okay? And the majority, yeah, okay, and the majority of this guide describes how you can use these options to create your desired behavior. So, and of course, you can also read the API reference to like know everything, which is important to remember, right? It's like what we are reading now isn't actually, I mean, maybe you could argue that it's documented, or I mean, of course, it's the documentation, but it's a guide, right? It's not the API reference. So whenever you're Googling for stuff, make sure that you always also look into the API reference if you're wondering about some particular thing. It's always actually very, very useful to read up on specific things. Let's just, as an example, right? Let's just jump into the API reference. I haven't actually seen this at all. Let's see what this looks like. Options. Oh, okay, cool. So they sent us directly to the options object, right? So here we have options / data, and then they're saying, okay, it's an object or a function. That's interesting. So restriction only accepts function when used in a component definition. Aha, okay. So if you're constructing a component, you might pass in a function instead of an object. But okay, wait. I'm realizing now I'm just jumping way too far in the deep end, and we shouldn't look too much at this, right? But I mean, I just wanted to get an idea of what's in here. This is some really good stuff, right? Really good stuff for sure. Maybe I could search for like #L, for example. No. Too bad. But could I search for anything hashtag? Template. No, okay, so that's why. Sorry. Can we search for L? No. Sorry, now I'm in apologies. I'm searching in the guide. I was meaning to search in the API reference. So let's jump back to the API reference. So silly of me. And what I wanted to know is that there's a bunch of interesting stuff here. So, can I search for... No, okay, I can't search for the hashtags like that. That was unfortunate. But I wanted to know, like, for example, something we know about is EL, the EL property. And I wanted to know whether we can read up more on that. But, yeah, maybe we could do this. Yeah, we can. Okay, cool. So I could put #EL up here. So, for example, here, like, there's some more information about the EL property that you pass to the Vue options. Or yeah, that's part of the Vue options, right? So it's one of the properties that you can change. So I wonder if all of this stuff is... no, okay, sorry. So it's... yeah, of course, there are headers, right? Sorry, I didn't realize this because I'm too zoomed in. But there's, of course, this table of contents where what we were looking at now, yeah, I mean, I didn't intend to look at this, but where we are now is at render error, but you have all of these top level headers here. So, for example, options data, right? That explains all the different parts of the options object that you pass to a new Vue instance. Options lifecycle hooks, right? That explains all of the hooks that you can hook into. Let's see, I mean, there are a bunch of different stuff here, right? Of course, we don't necessarily understand all of it, but we'll get to that, right? Instance properties. This is actually stuff we're going to talk about in just a moment. Instance method events, right? And so forth. Directives, right? So here's the list of directives. So we've talked about a few directives. Let's think about this. We've talked about vif, v4 we've talked about, and vmodel and vbind we've talked about. VON we've also talked about, right? But there are a bunch of other ones, right? You can see here we have vHTML, vtext, v1s. This stuff we haven't talked about. So here's like the full list of directives. Bunch of special attributes. I don't even know what this is yet, right? But we'll see. Okay, anyways, let me drop this, right? Interesting stuff. Definitely, like if you're wondering about some particular specific thing, always check out the API reference first, right? Super good place to be. Okay, just generally I mean that, right? Not just for Vue.js. I mean, all of the big libraries or frameworks have API references. Okay, let's continue. So a Vue application consists of a root Vue instance, okay? So if you have a Vue application, you're nesting Vue instances within Vue instances. It seems like that, right? Or wait, yes. No, exactly, right? But the inner Vue instances are components, as we talked about in the last episode, right? Where we talked about how you can compose components to build up this hierarchical application. And that's actually what they're saying here, right? A Vue application consists of a root Vue instance created with new Vue, optionally organized into a tree of nested, reusable components, right? This is exactly what we talked about last time, right? So we talked about it in depth, so I'm going to try to stop myself from talking too much about it. But here they're giving a cool example of how it might look like, or what it might look like, right? So you have a root instance, so your sort of new Vue, you say var vm equals new Vue, and then you pass a bunch of stuff. But then inside that, let's say inside the HTML, inside the template of the outermost Vue instance, you are constructing, you're adding an element which says to-do list, for example, right? You're adding a custom element, which is your own component, and that's called to-do list. So then you need to also define a new Vue, which is a component, which is called to-do list. And then you put that alongside, right? Exactly as we have here, right? You can see on line 2, we are saying Vue.component, which is then short for new Vue, but with some predefined options that we talked about last time. I mean, we don't yet know what the predefined options are, but we know that there are predefined options. So that's, oops, what am I doing? Like this. Okay, sorry. So here we are designing a component, and here we are creating the outermost Vue. And this doesn't look nested, right? Of course, it doesn't really do that. It doesn't look nested. But again, the point is that you want to be able to design your components not just so that they can be used in one specific place, but so that they are reusable. And for that reason, it doesn't make any sense to sort of create a component inside another component, like defining that component within that other component. Think about it. That's like defining a class within a class in object-oriented programming, or like declaring a function within a function. Now that might be useful because of the name escapes me, but scoping. Closures, sorry, because that gives you a closure. We don't need to worry about what that is, right? But it's like you're hiding one function from, or one function is available in a local namespace, but it's not available in the global namespace, right? And similarly with that class scenario, where it's like if you're defining a class within a class, then that class is available within this class, but it's not like polluting the global namespace. And there might be reasons for doing this, right? Like there might be scenarios where people would argue that that's useful. And I mean, it's clearly especially closures. But that's not what we want to do with our components, right? We want our components to be reusable across the system. So hence we define our components, we declare the existence of these components on a broader level, sort of side by side, right? But then when we use the components, we're using them hierarchically, and that's what they're showing here, right? So they're not, this list that they have here, or this nested list, here they are showing how these components might be employed in any particular application, not how they are defined within each other, right? I hope that kind of makes sense, right? So it's like so now we don't have a template for the main component, which we discussed last time that you can, but if we jump over to the index.html file, you can see that this app div that we have, that's our EL element. That's where we are rendering our Vue instance into. So that's sort of like the template for our Vue instance, and it contains a cart item entry here, or a cart item element, and that cart item element is what we defined in the JS file. So that's our custom component. So even though they are defined, like the components are defined side by side, we can use them within each other, right? And that's the point. And that's when they're saying like optionally organized into a tree of nested reusable components, right? We're nesting the components using the HTML. So and yeah, so the tree might look like this, right? You have the root instance, then you have a to-do list, and within the to-do list you have two pieces. You have a to-do item. I guess they mean multiple to-do items. Yeah, they have multiple to-do items, and then you have a to-do list footer, right? I mean, actually, sorry, maybe they're just showing one to-do item. So let's say there's one to-do item. So root instance, and then inside that we have a to-do list, and inside the to-do list component there is a to-do item. But alongside that, there's also a to-do list footer, right? And inside the to-do item, there is a delete to-do button and there is an edit to-do button, right? And inside the to-do list footer, there's a clear to-dos button and a to-do list statistics, right? So, and yeah, here, I mean, for example, when I got confused about Vue models before, like to-do list statistics in like, no, we're not talking about Vue, right? But when you have that kind of thing, you're like computing a bunch of statistics, like the average number of to-dos cleared per day or whatnot, right? So that stuff you might not necessarily want to do in the Vue, you probably don't want, most likely you don't want to do that in the Vue. So maybe you want to do that in a Vue model, or you want to do that in a model that the Vue model is calling or being passed. Okay. So that's sort of, we're nesting components, but again, like we're sort of iterating stuff that we've already talked about. So, and they were saying here, okay, we'll talk about the component system in detail later, but now, as we already know, components are Vue instances, but they have some specific options, and that's it, right? And that's it, right? That's creating a Vue instance, and that's what they're saying about Vue instances. And we are sort of just repeating stuff that we already know. So the next piece is data and methods. And then we have instance lifecycle hooks. So yeah, let's push forward. I was thinking maybe we should break here, but let's push forward. Let's talk about data and methods. So when a Vue instance is created, it adds all the properties found in its data object to Vue's reactivity system. Quote, I'm reading, right? When the values of those properties change, the Vue will react, updating the match to the new values. I mean, this we know. Vue is reactive, right? You put stuff. So when you are instantiating Vue, when you are instantiating a Vue or a component, then you are passing an object, and that object that options object, sorry, I got very confused, contains a data property, so key called data, and that data property points to another options object, which is like the data model, we've called it before, right? It's the data model, and that's also an object, like a POJO. And whenever, and then you're declaring that you want to listen to these particular options, and then you can change these options. You can change the value of these things within the data model, and your Vue, so your Vue instance will react, causing your template, like your actual Vue, or not. I mean, your template isn't your actual Vue, but your actual Vue, like displayed Vue that is rendered using your template. It will cause that to update if it needs to update on the basis of the changes that have been made to your data model, I should have said. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go through that because we talked about the reactivity system sort of in depth, and this is just an example of that again, right? It's like they're constructing some data, they're passing in that data to a new instance of Vue through the data property, and then they say vm.a. So they are assuming there's a property A, or I mean they're explicitly saying up here there's a property called A, and then you can change the property A by accessing that thing on the VM, on the Vue model, on the Vue instance. You can say Vue instance, like any given Vue instance, dot some property, which is some property of your data model, and then you set that. Or sorry, actually here they were showing that you can get that, but you can't set that, and that means that it's updating anywhere where that thing is referenced. And then vice versa, if you are passing in a so let me put it this way. If you're so what we are doing in our example is that we are sort of on the fly constructing our data object and passing it into the Vue. But what they are doing in their example is that they are passing in a variable instead, and then they have this variable, let's say called data up here, that contains this whole data model. So maybe, I mean, instead of data, let's actually just call this model, right? So model and then model. And what they are saying then is that you can change either model dot, let's say fruit is what we are working with, right? So you change that to apple, and that would reflect in your VM, like in your Vue instance. But you can also just change in the VM fruit is equal to apple, and that would reflect the other way. So that would change the value in the model. So I mean, because this is mutation, right? It's like, yeah, or sorry, no, it's actually, sorry, it's not necessarily yeah, it's okay. It's not obviously mutation because we're not actually referencing exactly the same thing. But I guess okay. So sorry. This wouldn't necessarily have to be the case, or mustn't necessarily be the case. Well, that doesn't make any sense. They could have implemented it differently, is my point. So it's of course important that they're telling us this, right? Because since they are sort of copying over and reconstructing all of our properties, as we've talked about before, because they are constructing listeners for all of our different properties, when they are building up the Vue instance, then they could have just sort of ignored our old object. But I assume that maybe they were thinking about, like, well, maybe there are some edge cases of mutation where if we assume that we won't change, yeah, let's not go there. I was going to say that maybe they decided to go full mutation because maybe there are some edge cases that makes it difficult to not touch the original model object that was passed in, because they are working with mutation, because even if they're copying over stuff, like let's say they are copying over stuff that can't be recursively copied. But I mean, everything can be recursively copied because, I mean, it's an array, or it's an object, or it's a value. No, sorry, but you might pass something that's an instance of a class that you've constructed, and then how would they clone that? Yeah, okay, so probably that's the reason. Maybe I'm wrong. Please let me know if you have a comment on that. I would assume that that's the reason. It might be difficult for them to create a deep copy of your object, of your data model, given that they don't know what you've put in your data model, and it might be arbitrarily complex. And if you have user-defined types, then they might not be able to clone them. Or I mean, they are not able to clone them, I assume, but I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Anyways, the point is, the mutation goes both ways. So if you have a variable that you can, where you put some object into, and then you pass that variable as your data model to the Vue instance when you construct a Vue instance, then whenever you change values in your Vue instance, that change will also be reflected in your model. In your old variable, right? And let's just look at this ourselves as well, like very quickly. So we go back to the index.html page, and let's just open this. Whoops. No, what am I doing? So let's open this page. Yeah, like that, sorry. Let me turn off wrapping here just so it's a bit prettier. Okay, and then let's go back to main.js, and let me make the font size bigger of this, And then you can see, okay, we've actually changed to Apple, but let's do one of these things at a time, right? So let's remove, or let's comment out this first line where we say model.fruit, so where we change a property using the model. And let's only keep vm.fruit, right? So our Vue instance dot some property equals some value. So we're changing it like directly on the Vue instance. And then you can see it changes to Apple, right? And just to show that this works. If I comment out that line as well, you can see our default is orange because that's the value we start with in our data model. And then of course, if we change the property on the model, so now we're changing the property on the object that we, or using the variable that we originally passed to the Vue instance, or to the constructor of the Vue class when producing our Vue instance, or when instantiating our Vue instance. If we change it in that end, that also works. Then it also changes it, right? And of course, in both cases, then it reflects, right? So it's when we're changing model.fruit, we're also changing vm.fruit, and when we're changing vm.fruit, we're also changing model.fruit. So maybe I should have showed it actually by saying console log vm.fruit here, right? And then if we open up the console, and then we let me make the text a bit bigger. And then we, whoops, too big. And let's say clear. And then we refresh. You can see we get Apple. Yeah, because we've changed it to Apple. And then if we do it the other way around, so we change it in VM, and then we console log whatever is in model, then you can see we still get Apple, right? So we're changing one and printing the other. Okay, but I mean, this you probably already knew. But again, like the important point is to realize that whatever variable we're passing in from the beginning, we are mutating that. We are mutating the contents of that object that we passed in as the data model, and we're not just mutating the values on the Vue model itself. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So, yep, and then there's this important point that we've discussed in length, or in great detail in a previous episode. So it's called like the reactivity system in depth or something like that. So we're not going to talk about that here, right? But they're emphasizing that if the property exists when the Vue model is created, when a Vue instance is created, then they can track that for changes. But if it doesn't exist, then they can't track it. So if you add a new property, then Vue can track that, right? So then it's not updated. And so it's not enough to just specify the existence of a property in a template, in the HTML template. You have to specify it in the data model upon construction of the Vue component, or the root Vue instance. Or you use, I can't remember what that's called, right? But we could find that in the API reference. But I mentioned in a previous video that you can also tell Vue that you now have a new property. But again, like I would just spontaneously assume that it's better, like much better, if you can avoid adding new properties over time and rather just specifying them from the beginning, right? Because it's also like a template problem. It's a bit strange that you suddenly have this new value. Well, if you suddenly have this new value, what about your template? Like, what have your template been displaying meanwhile? Because if your template have been displaying a null, which would then be displayed as an empty string, as we've seen before, then you could have just said that it exists from the beginning and it's empty string, right? So that just makes more sense. But anyways, that's a design decision and a design discussion. Okay, so, and yeah, they're saying here, same thing. They won't update it. But if it does exist from the beginning, they will update it. Here's the thing we didn't talk about. If you use Object.freeze, which is not a Vue thing, it's a JavaScript thing, right? Let's actually look at Object.freeze.js. And so Object.freeze is about telling a variable that it can't be changed or something like that, like turning it into a constant. And then they can track it, and I assume that that's not necessarily a design decision from Vue.js's point of view. It's more like technically they probably can't do that because of the way freezing in JavaScript works. So let's look at this, right? These are the docs for JavaScript. So the Object.freeze method freezes an object. A frozen object can no longer be changed. Freezing an object prevents new properties from being added to it, right? So that's probably a big deal for them. And existing properties from being removed prevents changing the enumerability, configurability, or writability of existing properties, and prevents the values of existing properties from being changed. So I mean, if you froze your original model, how would they mutate back? How would they mutate in data back into your object? That's not going to work. Freezing an object also prevents its prototype from being changed. Yeah, so you can't add like methods to it. And freeze returns the same object that was passed in. Okay, so I mean that's freeze. I'm wondering. Let's just try this out. No, okay, so they're saying the reactivity system can't track changes. I was wondering, I was thinking that maybe you could envision, maybe it would be possible to implement it such that your Vue model, like your root instance or your Vue instance, would still be able to track changes. Like if you change things in the Vue instance, if you change properties of the Vue instance, or if you change properties of the data model in the Vue instance, then maybe they could still react to that. But maybe the issue would be that they can't track changes in your original model. But yeah, but then you wouldn't even be able to change things in your original model since you've said that it's frozen. But I'm a bit curious. Let's just try this out to see what happens. Wait, let me actually keep the console up because we might get an error from this. So let's just make sure that this works still. Let me just refresh. We're all fine. So what happens if I say Object.freeze model, right? And then we refresh. So model is our own object. So now we've frozen it. We are still rendering, no errors. But if I try to add orange here, yeah, you can see I'm clicking the button, but nothing happens. Oops, sorry. Wait, Siri is talking on my phone. I got so confused. I'm like, what is this sound? Okay, Googling for frozen. Apologies for that. So yeah, you can see here we have this, we get this error. Cannot assign to read-only property fruit of object. But that's actually, yeah, okay. I mean, it seems then that they were able to track it, right? But if I said, when did that change? I said add and that didn't work. Okay, so so add didn't do anything, but when I start to type, assign to read property fruit of object, yeah. Okay. Anyways, let's just make sure that, so I'm removing the freezing and I'm refreshing, and I just want to make sure that this add button works, right? So we're not continuing with a broken application. Okay, so this would suggest to me that it's not just that it's not that they're copying over properties to the Vue instance. It might be that they're actually reusing our old model object. They've just, actually, we can trivially figure that out. Let's do this. Maybe they actually answered that for us. Wait a minute. Because they said, yeah, okay, sorry. I should read the docs more carefully. Okay, so they are not copying over stuff, right? What's inside the Vue instance, the data model inside the Vue instance. No. Sorry. Okay, wait. Whew. Okay, so confusing. Here they're looking at a particular property. What I wanted to say was, no, but of course it can't be exactly the same thing. Sorry, of course it can't be exactly the same thing. What I wanted to say is that, okay, if we print the model here in our, but then maybe it can, yeah. How interesting. Yeah, I should stop being confusing. So okay, let me do it this way. If I print the model, we get this, and if I print vm dot, can I print data like that? Okay, actually, yeah, we have to do, or we have to do this. We're gonna see that in just a moment. So that's actually our data object. But of course, the properties on VM, that's like VM is different because it contains a bunch of more stuff. But I guess if we say model, is that equal to VM dot data? Yes. Okay. So the answer is they are using the model that we passed in. and they are essentially assigning setters and getters to that. So they are actually mutating the data model that we passed in, rather than sort of copying over everything and producing a new object. So they're simply just using the model that we passed in. And this we can see here. I mean, we can even say strictly equals true, but I guess that doesn't really make any difference. So we can see that that's true because our model variable is the same thing as what's behind the $sign data property of our Vue instance, which we called VM. And this $sign data we'll talk about later, but I think it's also on the same page here, because it's a property of the Vue instance that gives us the data model. So anyways, let's now drop this, right? But this is an interesting excursion in like how Vue is actually implemented. So we need to be careful, because the original data that we passed in, if we happen to mutate that for some reason, we will also spawn changes in our view, essentially. Okay, so freezing is a no-go. You can't freeze it. And yeah, as they showed here, this doesn't work, like stuff doesn't work if you freeze. And then, okay, so here's the answer to what we just looked at now with the $sign, right? So moving on to something new. In addition to data properties, Vue instances expose a number of useful instance properties and methods. These are prefixed with $sign, and that's so that you can differentiate them from user-defined properties, right? And we just saw an example of that when we did vm.$sign data. So that gives us the data object, and that's one of these properties of a Vue instance. And as you can see here, we have some examples more. You can also say $el, and that gives us the element that we've rendered the Vue instance that we've rendered the Vue instance into, right? Or that we've we've rendered our template with our model into. And you can see, I guess it's interesting to note that they're saying, okay, vm.el strictly equals the element that they find using plain JavaScript by saying get element by ID. So it's not like it's a string representation of the EL. The EL is the actual DOM element, like the document object model element, like the HTML element in your HTML, essentially, right? So I mean, what I mean is this, like if we open up the console here again, and then what did we call it? We called it VM, our Vue instance. So if we say vm.$sign, and actually here in the sort of code completion, you can see that we have tons of different properties and methods that we can call on VM. But vm $sign, what was I looking for? Not data, but EL. You can see then that we get back, it's not a string representation, right? This is the actual element, which you can also see is evidently true, because when I hover over it, Chrome is able to identify which element we are talking about. So we get back that thing, right? Which is pretty cool, like if you think about it, because we also have this component inside. So I'm wondering if we could access, like we could probably access the component. Yeah, but no, but that doesn't really make any sense. Yeah. I'm just thinking. I was just thinking like we could be able to identify the HTML or the HTML element, the DOM element of that component of some particular cart item. But anyways, I mean, for another time, right? We could probably definitely do that. Probably definitely. That's a very strange way of talking. Anyways, so there are a bunch of properties and methods on the Vue instance, and again, API reference, where's the link? API reference. Let's go back down again so I don't forget where I am. And in the API reference, I'm pretty sure that we saw that there are a bunch of properties. So you can see that list of properties here in the end, right? Instance. Yeah, actually, I mean, so there are a bunch of these $$ properties, as you can see. But here we have instance properties, instance methods and data, instance methods / events, and instance methods / lifecycle. Right? Oh, okay, so they don't mean or. They mean instance methods concerning lifecycle, instance methods related to events, instance methods related to data, right? And then instance properties. So lots of stuff that we can read up on to get an idea of what we can do with a Vue instance. And yeah, okay, sorry, I should have read first. And that's what they say here in the docs as well. You can consult the API reference for a full list of instance properties and methods. So we will see what they cover and what they don't cover, and maybe we'll have to dive into that further on as well. Okay, so I think I'm going to cut here. The next episode is going to be on instance lifecycle hooks. So then we're going to talk about the hooks, and we're going to talk about this lifecycle diagram, like what happens to a Vue instance and what are the different things that you can hook into. Remember to subscribe so that you won't miss any upcoming videos in this series. Hit the like button if you appreciate this video. Thanks a ton for watching this series, and I hope you're making progress on your Vue app or whatever you're hacking on with Vue. Let me know in the comments. Please share something that you are working on. Thanks a ton for watching, and I will see you in the next one.